Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video where we're taking a look at a channel today that I have never looked at before. This showed up in my recommended videos, and it's What Civil War Generals Think of Each Other by the channel Unhinged Past. They have about 7,000 subscribers, and I thought this was an interesting topic to dive into. If you're familiar with me at all and my love of history, the Civil War is really kind of my bread and butter topic as far as the topic I feel like I know the best of anything. That's definitely the one I've spent the most time studying throughout my life, going all the way back to childhood. And I think this will be an interesting topic, just hearing direct firsthand quotes from Civil War generals talking about other Civil War generals. Specifically, as I look at the list here, we've got Grant talking about a whole bunch of other generals. We've got Lee talking about a bunch of other generals. We've got Sherman talking about a few. And then we've got quotes from Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, and George Meade talking about others. Now, I'm familiar with some of Grant's quotes, having read his autobiography, which is where I'm sure a lot of these will come from. And what I'll try to do is I'll let each one of these go, and then I'll try to wait toward the end, or at least break it up at key points and talk a little bit more about those people that are involved in this topic. And I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out and check out that channel without my commentary. I want to thank Brad from West Long Branch, New Jersey, who just signed up as a patron. Thank you so much for your support. I'm grateful, and I truly appreciate it. Let's go ahead and dive into this one. So right off the bat, I see we're getting an image from the movie Lincoln. This is Jared Harris, son of the famous actor Richard Harris, playing Grant. And I thought he did a great job as Grant in that movie.
Despite the ongoing war and being enemies, many generals spoke respectfully of their opponents. Today, we're going to discover what famous U.S. Civil War figures thought of each other. Write in the comments what you think of these generals. Ulysses S. Grant about Robert E. Lee.
I never ranked Lee as highly as some others of the Army. That is to say, I never had as much anxiety when he was in my front as when Joe Johnston was in my front.
That's actually I want to pause there because that's a great way of measuring an opponent. Is how much anxiety did that guy cause me in terms of me just not knowing what to expect and me feeling unprepared and not able to deal with him. Grant always had a healthy respect for his opponents, people like Lee, but he never feared Lee as much as he did Johnston, because he knew Johnston was capable of surprising him. And I think he had a pretty good handle on who Lee was by this point.
Lee was a good man who had everything in his favor. He was a man who needed sunshine. He was supported by the unanimous voice of the South. He was supported by a large party in the North. He had the support and sympathy of the outside world. All this is of immense advantage to a general. Lee had this in a remarkable degree. Everything he did was right. He was treated like a demigod. Our generals had a hostile press, lukewarm friends, and a public opinion outside. The cry was in the air that the North only won by brute force, that the generalship and valor were with the South. This has gone into history with so many allusions that are historical. Lee was of a slow, conservative, cautious nature, without imagination or humor, always the same with grave dignity. I could never see in his achievements what justifies his reputation. The illusion that nothing but heavy odds beat him will not stand the ultimate light of history. I know it is not true. Lee was a good deal of a headquarters general, a desk general from what I hear, and from what his officers say. He was almost too old for active service, the best service in the field. At the time of the surrender, he was 58 or 59, and I was 43. His officers used to say he posed himself, that he was retiring and exclusive, and that his headquarters were difficult of access.
Grant about
So I will say this. I understand where Grant's coming from with a lot of that stuff, because there definitely was a double standard when you think about the support that Lee had compared to what a guy like Joe Johnston had, who one of the biggest issues in the South was that Jefferson Davis had favorites. And that often meant that men who were worthy of command didn't get it, or had a very short leash, or guys like John C. Pemberton, for example, who had no business in command, were given command because they were friends and they were a favorite of Lee. That's why Joe Johnston is constantly kind of pulled out of the service and then thrown back in when there's nowhere else to turn. And there definitely was some of that. And I can see why Grant could say, Union generals didn't didn't have that same luxury that Lee did. I wouldn't go quite so far as to say that Lee had everything going for him, because obviously he had some challenges as the general that was in command of the Southern Army, with their challenges as far as resources and manpower and things like that go. But I also think he's dead on when he talks about the lost cause narrative, which is Lee was the noble, great general, and he was just bludgeoned to death by manpower and superior resources, rather than by a general who was his peer, if not greater. I think Grant was a better strategist than Lee ever was. Lee was a good tactician on the battlefield, but he was not a good strategist. He made very poor strategic decisions often. And I'll wait until we talk about Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson.
From all I know of Jackson and all I see of his campaigns, I have little doubt of the result. If Jackson had attempted on Sheridan the tactics he attempted so successfully upon others, he would not only have been beaten, but destroyed. Sudden, daring raids under a fine general like Jackson might do against raw troops and inexperienced commanders, such as we had in the beginning of the war, but not against drilled troops and a commander like Sheridan. The tactics for which Jackson is famous and which achieved such remarkable results belonged entirely to the beginning of the war and to the peculiar conditions under which the earlier battles were fought. They would have ensured destruction to any commander who tried them upon Sherman, Thomas, Sheridan, Meade, or in fact, any of our great generals. Consequently, Jackson's fame as a general depends upon achievements gained before his generalship was tested, before he had a chance of matching himself with a really great commander. No doubt so able and patient a man as Jackson, who worked so hard at anything he attempted, would have adapted himself to new conditions and risen with them. He died before his opportunity.
Grant.
So that's a great point. I like that he said that at the end, because number one, this happens with any person who dies at the height of their fame and glory, is that we tend to elevate them to another level because of when and how they died. John F. Kennedy, I think, is a much more highly praised and popular president because he was assassinated at so young an age in the middle of his first term, that we don't know what might have happened in a second term. We don't know how things might have shaped up with Vietnam, for example. If things had escalated the way they did in Vietnam, maybe we remember Kennedy very differently. Same thing with Stonewall Jackson. He dies he's mortally wounded on the night of the height of his fame, with his big flank maneuver that he succeeds with at Chancellorsville. And because of that, people tend to think Chancellorsville, Jackson was on top of his game. Man, he was on the ascendancy. It was only going to be uphill. It was only going to be great from there. But we forget that, number one, the Valley Campaign, every battle he won in the Valley Campaign, he had a superior force on the battlefield. Yes, he did some great strategy as far as bouncing around and defeating different forces that combined outnumbered him, but it was poor generalship on the part of those he faced for never concentrating their forces. The time that he did actually face a stronger opponent, he lost that battle. And then he marches his troops over to participate in the 7 Days campaign and does terribly there. He did not do well at 7 Days. He did not do particularly well at Fredericksburg, where Meade broke his line. And if Meade had had any support whatsoever, or had been in command of that entire wing of the army, would have destroyed Jackson's forces at Fredericksburg and probably won that battle. So I think we ignore all of that because of how he died and everything, and then there's all the what ifs about what if he had been at Gettysburg. But I do like that Grant said, but also Jackson was a good general, and he was a smart guy, and he worked hard, and he would have adapted to the changing conditions of the war, which is absolutely true. And we could say this about any of these generals. We could say Lee only looked as good as he did because he faced poor commanders earlier in the war, which is true. Really, it's only about a year, though, that Lee has that great success between when he takes over in the summer of 62 and when he loses the Battle of Gettysburg a year later. I mean, we're really only talking about a year of shining successes by Lee. If you put Meade in command of those armies in 62, different story. Put Grant there, different story. Likewise, you could say that about Grant, though. Grant faced Pemberton. He faced one of the weakest generals to ever command an army for the South. If Lee had been out there in the West, or if Joe Johnston had been in command of all those armies, maybe it's a different story. Who knows?
And about George McClellan.
McClellan is to me one of the mysteries of the war. He had the way of inspiring you with the idea of immense capacity, if he would only have a chance. Then he is a man of unusual accomplishments, a student, and a well-read man. I have never studied his campaigns enough to make up my mind as to his military skill.
I just want to pause right here because you notice how careful he's being about how he describes this thing. Grant, one of his greatest, one of the best things about him was also a great weakness that he had, which is that he tended to be very charitable toward people. He rarely, like in his memoirs, he almost always compliments someone before he criticizes them or compliments them after he criticizes them. He very rarely just throws a criticism out there and leaves it hanging. He tries to figure out some way to justify why they would have done what they did, and he always seems to look for the best in people, but that also meant he got taken advantage of by people in his administration and finances, things like that, because he trusted people too much sometimes. So it seems like he's really trying to look for a way to understand McClellan, who had so much going for him and did so little with it.
But all my impressions are in his favor. I have entire confidence in McClellan's loyalty and patriotism. But the test which was applied to him would be terrible to any man, being made a major general at the beginning of the war. It has always seemed to me that the critics of McClellan do not consider this vast and cruel responsibility. The war, a new thing to all of us, the Army knew, everything to do from the outset with a restless people and Congress. McClellan was a young man when this devolved upon him, and if he did not succeed, it was because the conditions of success were so trying.
I'm not willing to be so charitable, McClellan, as this.
If McClellan had gone into the war as Sherman, Thomas, or Meade had fought his way along and up, I have no reason to suppose that he would not have won as high a distinction as any of us.
Grant about...
So it's kind of interesting. He's basically, number one, he's right. McClellan's super intelligent. He starts at West Point at 16, ends up rising pretty high in the ranks of civilian life, and he's in his mid-30s when he's made a major general and given command of the largest army this continent had ever seen, and then fails miserably because he's great at inspiring the men and gets their loyalty and great at training them into an army, but then he's afraid to use it. And I think that a lot of that comes from he loved the Army and didn't want to see it destroyed. Grant makes an interesting point about, McClellan was basically thrust to high command without working his way up through the ranks. Would things have been different if McClellan had been a brigade commander first and worked his way up? I don't know, but here's the problem I have with McClellan is that there was no humility there. He thought he was better than everybody else. He said horrible things about people like Lincoln, who he had no respect for. And yes, he had trying conditions, but so did Grant. Grant had awful conditions that he had to deal with under Halleck out west and the situation that he was dealing with there, but he rose through that anyway. I'm just not willing to be charitable to him the way that Grant is.
Ambrose Burnside.
General Burnside was an officer who was generally liked and respected. He was not, however, fitted to command an army. No one knew this better than himself. He always admitted his blunders and extenuated those of officers under him beyond what they were entitled to.
So, let me
It was
finish.
hardly his fault that he was ever assigned to a separate command.
So he says no one knew this better than Burnside. It was said that when Burnside found out he had been ordered to take command of the Army of the Potomac that he wept. Because I think he knew he was not suited for that command. And Grant served with Burnside. Burnside served directly under Grant in 64 and 65, late in the war. And so he had a good handle on who Burnside was and what he was capable of. And Burnside ends up a senator after the war and was generally liked by people and had some qualities that I think made him better than some of the guys who commanded armies during the American Civil War. But you can tell, if Grant's that critical of you, it's a pretty good indication.
Grant about Gideon Pillow.
Boy.
I'm not saying Pillow would shoot himself. I believe, however, that he would report himself wounded if he received a minor scratch.
That's absolutely so accurate. So Gideon Pillow is the guy that he faces at Fort Donelson. And Pillow had this insanely high level of opinion of himself to where he got out of Dodge, so to speak. Like he fled Fort Donelson rather than surrender his command because he felt he was too desperately needed by the Confederacy to fall into enemy hands. And when Grant says, I'm not saying he would shoot himself, but if he got a minor wound, he'd probably report it as a big deal. It says everything about what Grant thought of Pillow.
About James Longstreet.
They were friends.
Longstreet was an entirely different man. He was brave, honest, intelligent, a very capable soldier, subordinate to the superiors, just and kind to his subordinates, but jealous of his own rights, which he had the courage to maintain. He was never on the lookout for a slight, but saw one as soon as anybody when intentionally given. It may be that Longstreet was not sent to Knoxville for the reasons stated, but because Mr. Davis had an exalted opinion of his own military genius.
So he's talking,
and thought he saw a chance of killing two birds with one stone.
Grant.
So, first of all, Grant and Longstreet are friends. They know each other, going back to West Point. They served together. Longstreet is at Grant's wedding. Some people have said Longstreet was his best man. We don't know that for sure, but he was definitely there because he was Grant's wife's cousin. They were always close. Contrary to popular belief, Longstreet did not serve as an ambassador under Grant. He served, I think, for about 5 months as the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, but that was under Hayes and Garfield, not Grant. It was in late 1880, early 1881. But they were definitely friends. He's obviously a little biased when it comes to talking about Longstreet, and he specifically mentions Knoxville because Knoxville is like the one and only time during the war that Longstreet is sent and given his own independent command. All the rest of the war, he's serving under Lee, or when he comes out west and he serves in Braxton Bragg's army.
About George Custer.
I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself that was wholly unnecessary. Wholly unnecessary.
Grant about
So he's talking about a very specific moment in Custer's life, 1776, Little Bighorn. So he doesn't really talk about him in the American Civil War because Custer served under Grant as part of the Army of the Potomac under Meade in 64 and 65. And so he did talk a little bit more about Custer than that, but that's one small glimpse of what he thought of Custer later in life. Well, this one's going to be really interesting because Braxton Bragg, there's not a lot good to say about him.
Braxton Bragg.
Bragg was a remarkably intelligent and well-informed man, professionally and otherwise. He was also thoroughly upright, but he was possessed of an irascible temper and was naturally disputatious. A man of the highest moral character and the most correct habits, yet in the old army he was in frequent trouble. As a subordinate, he was always on the lookout to catch his commanding officer infringing his prerogatives. As a post commander, he was equally vigilant to detect the slightest neglect, even of the most trivial order.
Basically, what he's saying there is that Bragg was always looking to pick a fight with somebody. He was always very upright himself, but then he kind of held everybody else to this impossible standard, too.
I have heard in the old army an anecdote very characteristic of Bragg. On one occasion, when stationed at a post of several companies commanded by a field officer, he was himself commanding one of the companies and at the same time acting as post quartermaster and commissary.
Which Grant had also been a quartermaster.
As commander of the company, he made a requisition upon the quartermaster himself for something he wanted. As quartermaster, he declined to fill the requisition and endorsed on the back of it his reasons for so doing. As company commander, he responded to this, urging that his requisition called for nothing but what he was entitled to, and that it was the duty of the quartermaster to fill it. As quartermaster, he still persisted that he was right. In this condition of affairs, Bragg referred the whole matter to the commanding officer of the post. The latter, when he saw the nature of the matter referred, exclaimed, "My God, Mr. Bragg, you have quarreled with every officer in the army, and now you are quarreling with yourself."
Grant about
And there's several instances, and I shared this in my video, one of my videos about Bragg at the Shiloh battlefield. Bragg, at least a couple of instances where his own men tried to kill him. In fact, one time they put like an explosive artillery shell under his cot. It destroyed the cot, but didn't kill Bragg.
Abraham Lincoln.
The president is one of the few visitors I have had who have not attempted to extract from me a knowledge of my movements. although he is the only one who has a right to know them.
And that was fascinating for Lincoln to be that way with Grant, because Lincoln was that way with a lot of his other generals. Lincoln, for all of his positive traits, could be very overbearing in his role of commander-in-chief and not really let his generals be the generals in the field.
The greatest I have ever known, in the day of his death, the darkest of my life.
Grant about Joseph Johnston.
My own judgment is that Johnston acted very wisely. He husbanded his men and saved as much of his territory as he could, without fighting decisive battles in which all might be lost. As Sherman advanced, as I have shown, his army became spread out, until, if this had continued, it would have been easy to destroy it in detail. I know that Sherman and I were rejoiced when we heard of the change.
Grant about John Bell Hood.
And by the change, he means that Johnston was removed from command because, as I alluded to earlier, just didn't have the favor of his commander-in-chief.
Hood was unquestionably a brave, gallant soldier and not destitute of ability. But unfortunately, his policy was to fight the enemy wherever he saw him, without thinking much of the consequences of defeat.
Grant about Nathan.
And talking about Hood, Hood is one of those guys that's really fascinating to look at because he was a fantastic division commander. He ends up given an army command, but we have to remember that what happened between when he was a division commander and when he took army command, well, he loses the use of an arm from a severe wound at Gettysburg, bloodiest battle of the war, and then 2 months later he's in the West fighting in the second bloodiest battle of the war, and he has his femur shattered, which from everything I've heard is one of the most painful injuries you can have, and has his leg amputated almost right all the way up at the hip. Those two things would destroy the psyche of any commander. And it was after all of that he's given an army command. I just don't think Hood was the same guy after that.
And Forrest.
Forrest had about 4,000 cavalry with him, composed of thoroughly well-disciplined men, who under so able a leader were very effective. Smith's command was nearly double that of Forrest, but not equal, man to man, for the lack of successful experience such as Forrest's men had. The fact is, troops who have fought a few battles and won, and followed up their victories, improve upon what they were before to an extent that can hardly be counted by percentage. The difference in result, if often a decisive victory instead of inglorious defeat. This same difference, too, is often due to the way troops are officered, and for that particular kind of warfare which Forrest had carried on, neither army could present a more effective officer than he was.
Robert E. Lee about...
And yeah, so it's interesting in talking about Forrest. Obviously, it's tough to get a handle on what kind of general Forrest was because he had a very unique role. He was kind of to harass the enemy. He was the guy that was the raider. He was the behind enemy lines type. He was very good at that, and everyone seems to have thought so. And he had risen from, he's a very wealthy guy. He starts out as a private at the beginning of the war, but through his wealth, he is able to, like a lot of people, get higher command as he trains and equips soldiers that sometimes under his own expense. And he rises to high command and seems to do really well in his role.
About William T. Sherman.
Sherman was the most successful of all Union officers in the Civil War. The claims of unbounded license of Sherman's soldiers in Georgia were greatly exaggerated. As a strategist and military commander, Sherman demonstrated the highest order of military genius.
Lee about Ulysses S. Grant.
Where do we get sufficient troops to oppose Grant? He is bringing to him now the 19th Corps, and will bring every man he can get. His talent and strategy consists in accumulating overwhelming numbers. Sir, if you ever presume again to speak disrespectfully of General Grant in my presence, either you or I will sever his connection with this university.
Robert E. Lee's words to a faculty member at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, after the faculty member had spoken insultingly of Ulysses S. Grant. Lee about Stonewall Jackson.
And here's the thing. Lee, obviously, he felt the way that a lot of people did in the South, which is that Grant came and just bludgeoned him to death with numbers. Which, to an extent is true, but Grant understood the situation. He understood what they were up against, and he knew how to win that kind of war. But Grant also has some brilliant moments out west, like the Vicksburg campaign, which is one of the most brilliant campaigns in American history. So I understand where Lee's coming from with that, and Lee, I think, the words that he speaks there to that faculty member when he's president of Washington University, which is now Washington and Lee University, it's where Lee's buried in Lexington. I think that a lot of that stems from his personal experience with Grant during the surrender. I think he saw Grant's quality. I think he understood that Grant was a noble person who had treated Lee and his army with a great deal of respect in defeat, and he wasn't going to tolerate anybody speaking ill of him after that.
Jackson.
He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. Who can fill his place I do not know. May his spirit be diffused.
Lee about
And that was a quote attributed to Lee in the aftermath of Jackson's death after the Battle of Chancellorsville. Seems all indications are that that's what he said. He never went to see him because Jackson lived for like a week after he was wounded. He had his arm amputated. He was recovering from the amputation, but then pneumonia set in, and there are a lot of reasons why that might have happened. But that was a consequence of wounds sometimes in the aftermath of it.
Bedford Forrest. After his surrender, when asked by a Union officer who he thought his greatest general was, General Robert E. Lee replied,
Sir, a gentleman I have never had the pleasure to meet, General Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Lee about John Bell Hood.
I've never heard that Lee quote about Forrest. And Forrest worked in the Western Theater, and so Lee wasn't actually given overall command of all Confederate forces the way that Grant was until very, very late in the war in 1965. By the time it meant absolutely nothing and could do nothing to help them win the war.
Hood is a bold fighter, very industrious on the battlefield, careless off. I have a high opinion on his gallantry, earnestness, and zeal. However, I'm doubtful as to other qualities necessary.
Lee about Jeb Stuart.
He never brought me false information. He was second to none in valor, in zeal, in unflinching devotion to his country. To military capacity of a high order and all the virtues of the soldier, he added the brighter graces of a pure life.
William T. Sherman.
And that's interesting about Stuart. And of course, he said he never brought me false information, but there were times that Stuart brought him no information. Sometimes a person's greatest quality can also be one of their biggest weaknesses, as I mentioned with Grant. Same thing with Stuart. For all that brashness and bravery, he could be a little too much of a glory hunter at times, and that sometimes caused him to lose sight of the bigger picture.
Sherman about Robert E. Lee.
I'm not a hater of Robert E. Lee, as some of our people seem to be. He was a kind, amiable man, had none of the vices usually ascribed to generals, drank no whiskey, smoked no cigars, but had an aversion to swearing. His habits were rather aristocratic, and he was a kind neighbor, a model citizen, and a father to the poor. But he had a reputation that both he and I did not covet.
Sherman about Ulysses.
A reputation that he and I did not covet. And understand, Sherman grew up, not exactly an aristocrat in the same way that Lee did. Lee came from a very illustrious family. He's a Southern kind of, the gentleman planter, so to speak, and all of that. But Sherman grows up. He's orphaned early in life and goes to live with a foster father, Ewing, who is high up in the government, and Sherman's own brother is going to end up a prominent U.S. senator from the state of Ohio. The Sherman Antitrust Act, that's his brother. I think he had another brother who was like on the state Supreme Court, and so there's a lot going for Sherman that I think he could relate to with Grant, that actually, or with Lee, that maybe made him a little different than Grant's upbringing.
S. Grant.
Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now we stand by each other.
Always.
I will accept no commission that would tend to create a rivalry with Grant. I want him to hold what he has earned and got.
Sherman about Nathan Bedford Forrest.
And Sherman also would say that he felt he was much more intelligent than Grant, which I think is probably true. Grant was not an unintelligent guy. He was a very smart guy. But Sherman, I think, was much more intellectual than Grant was. But he also recognized a lot of Grant's solid qualities, and he was always loyal to Grant, even when he disagreed with Grant. For example, when Grant gave the plan for the Vicksburg campaign that would ultimately take Vicksburg and ended up that being that brilliant campaign I talked about earlier, Sherman was strongly opposed to it, and he put down his opposition in writing, and he expressed it to Grant. But then he also told Grant, he said, I oppose this. I think it's going to fail. But if these are your orders, I will carry them out as though they were my own. And he did. And he recognized in the aftermath that he was wrong and Grant was right. But he was always loyal to Grant.
Forrest.
That devil Forrest must be hunted down and killed if it costs 10,000 lives and bankrupts the federal treasury. After all, I think Forrest was the most remarkable man our Civil War produced on either side.
Abraham Lincoln
And
about
a lot of people have said similar things.
Ulysses S. Grant.
Well, I hardly know what to think of him altogether. He's the quietest little fellow you ever saw. Why, he makes the least fuss of any man you ever knew. I believe 2 or 3 times he has been in this room a minute or so before I knew he was here. It's about so all around. The only evidence you have that he's in any place in that he makes things get. Where he is, things move. When Grant took hold, I was waiting to see what his pet impossibility would be.
His pet impossibility. He's like, dealing with people in high command, they've always got something about their character that I have to deal with. And he's finding Grant doesn't have that.
Reckoned it would be cavalry as a matter of course, for we hadn't horses enough to mount even what men we had. There were 15,000 or thereabouts up near Harper's Ferry, and no horses to put them on. Well, the other day, just as I expected, Grant sent to me about those very men, but what he wanted to know was whether he should disband them or turn them into infantry.
Jefferson Davis about...
A lot of people said this about Grant, is that most of these generals, they were always demanding something. I need more men. I need more supplies. I need more ammunition. I need more artillery. Grant, he worked with what he had, and he made the best of it. So he didn't demand more men. He simply gave an order, for example, that all the heavy artillery regiments that were protecting Washington, D.C. should be turned into infantry and sent out into the field. He just made do with what he had and did the best with it. And people talk about how Grant perpetually had this look on his face like he was about to put his head through a brick wall.
About Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. On April 19th, 1865, Davis learned Lincoln was dead. He commended,
"Well, General, I don't know. If it were to be done at all, it were better that it were well done. And if the same had been done to Andy Johnson, the Beast, and to Secretary Stanton, the job would then be complete."
George Meade about Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant has undoubtedly shown very superior abilities, and is, I think, justly entitled to all the honors they propose to bestow upon him. I believe Grant is honest and would not deceive me, but I think there is something more than is acknowledged.
So I'm not entirely sure what the context was of that quote from Meade. The sad thing about guys like Meade and Lee, for example, is that they died so soon after the war. Within a decade, they're both gone. That we didn't get a lot of memoirs and writings and reminiscences about their actions during the war, things that we got from people like Sherman and Longstreet and Grant, who all wrote memoirs afterwards. I would love to have seen such things from those guys in the level of depth we got from some of those other generals, but unfortunately we never did. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I thought that was something a little different, something interesting to talk about. I do want to give a couple of shout outs here before we finish up. I just want to thank Elizabeth in McKean, Pennsylvania. I think that's how it's pronounced, McKean. And Jason in the Colony, Texas. I have cousins who live in the Colony, Texas. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about how to support the channel on Patreon, the link is in the description. Thanks for watching.